Aye, kuwe kuwa madue.
Aye, kuwe amadue.
Aye, kuwe kuwa madue.
Aye, kuwe amadue.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
How you doing?
I'm doing well.
Excellent.
I'm glad to be here.
Thank you. Well, we're happy to have you here today, and we appreciate you being part of the Oral History Project.
Thank you.
Yes. So we're just going to get started with some more general questions, but first, could you state your name, please?
Yes, I'm Peter Pursley.
Peter Pursley.
Yeah.
Thank you.
My name is Babas Gerald Green.
Joe Brooks.
Peter, where did you grow up?
I grew up in Berkeley, California. I was born in San Francisco, but immediately came home to the flatlands of Berkeley. I lived there until my late teens, and went to the same grammar school and junior high school and high school as a number of my neighbors. We went together from kindergarten all the way through Berkeley High School, and some of us even wound up together at San Francisco State. So my upbringing was unusual in that it was in a stable neighborhood, highly diverse neighborhood, probably 25% African American, another 30% Asian of various ethnicities, Korean, Japanese, Chinese, Americans. Again, I think the distinctive feature of my upbringing was staying with the same group of kids throughout the entire grade school experience and high school. And we're still in touch, some of us.
Oh.
So that's pretty amazing.
Yeah. That's a whole life of just being able to get to actually know people and grow with people. So.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's really important. We're just going to get started real easily. And first, where did you grow up?
I was born in Brooklyn, New York. My father was in the Navy. He was a photographer, and every 3 years we moved to a different city. My first remembrance of where I lived was Norfolk, Virginia. I lived in Norfolk in a segregated community called Chesapeake Gardens, which is still there. It was all black when I lived there. It's now gorgeous. I lived in Washington, D.C., San Diego, Lexington Park, Maryland. So I grew up basically on the East Coast and the West Coast. Every 3 years we move.
Wow. What was that like, just having to move constantly? Was it hard to make friends? Was it just tough to get acclimated to your new surroundings, especially going from coast to coast?
Yeah, you know, children are very adaptive. And so, just like a lot of kids, a lot of people my age tell me when they grew up, I didn't realize I was poor, you know, because everyone was pretty much the same. So it's similar in the Navy, well, as military-dependent kids. We lived in communities pretty much where people were the same. People moved around a lot. In terms of making friends, I made friends and I made enemies. It was kind of funny in a way because 3 years came by, I said, well, I know I'm getting out of here now, go to a different place. But it made, the one thing it taught me, the best lesson it taught me was that white people were not inherently smarter than me. Because I went to school at an early age, integrated schools. And so that was a good lesson to learn very early in life.
Wow. And you mentioned one of the neighborhoods you grew up in Norfolk, it was segregated, I think.
Yeah, Chesapeake Gardens, it's still there. My grandparents moved there in probably 1951. And my understanding, it was built by a black developer. And these are the kind of things that you don't hear a lot about now. A black person built these houses.
Wow.
they were modest, 2 and 3 bedroom homes, and they were all sold to black people. And one thing about segregation during the 50s, you felt safe because your grandparents, your uncles and aunts, they all told you what could happen if you ventured too far out. So you stayed within your own little community. So that was, it was a great time to grow up.
That's interesting. And were some of the schools you're going to also segregated?
When I started off in Norfolk, yes. But Washington, D.C., I went to a school, I think it's still there, it's called Patterson. It was integrated. The school that sticks out the most to me was a school in San Diego. We moved to San Diego in 1959. I was in the 5th grade. My 6th grade teacher, Mr. Robert Matthews, he just recently died. He was the first black male teacher I had, one of the few. And he really helped me understand that academically I could be the best. And after the 6th grade, I stayed on the honors roll or dean's list, whatever you said, because of my experience having him as a teacher. And when I talked to him later in life, he said that he was given a free hand to try his own style of teaching method. And a lot of people my age would come back and talk to him because he had that much of an impact.
Wow.
But most of the schools I went to were integrated.
That's interesting.
When we moved back to Maryland, we moved back to Maryland in '63, and I went to a school. I was in the 8th grade. When I went to the 9th grade, I was in a high school in Lexington Park, Maryland. The high school was in a little small community called Great Mills. It's still there. Great Mills High School. The most racist, nastiest group of white folks I ever met.
Oh, wow.
And what they did for me was, because I already knew they weren't smarter than me, I put this academic chip on my shoulder. And I said to myself, okay, you guys can be nasty as you want. I'm going to be smarter than you. And that also was a kind of a turning point, because I had very little support from teachers. Very few, I wonder where some of the white, they called themselves my friends. Very few, if any, ever stood up for me. They call you. I grew up in the 9th grade. I thought my nickname was nigger.
Wow.
And that's just how frequent, and they throw shit at you. I'm talking about some nasty white folks. But, young, you live through that stuff. And I knew they weren't any smarter. And the other thing you learn is, as a black man growing up, I have a little bit of advantage because in the 9th grade, maybe I was 5'10". When I came back for the 10th grade, going to 11th grade, I was about 6 foot.
Okay.
So, and I weigh about 170 now, because I've come down in weight, and I was up to about 170 then. So I was, for a high school, I was pretty good size.
Yeah.
And so I learned then that white folks tend to be, unless there's a bunch of them, they tend to be cowards, because one-on-one, they're not going to want to mess with you. Even though I was not a fighter, there was just a perception that they thought I could do that.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
Were you playing any sports at the time?
That's funny. We moved from Lexington Park back to San Diego in 1966. I was a junior in high school. And all the jocks came up to me, "Oh, you gonna play football for us?" I said, "Man, I don't like getting hit. Are you gonna play basketball for us?" And I said, "I can't shoot." I'm serious. I like swimming.
There you go.
But, so no, I'm not an athlete. I mean, let me phrase it differently. I did not play competitive athletic sports in high school.
Got it.
It was funny, I can still see the disappointment on their face. Here's this tall, kind of slender brother. And I said, man, I don't like getting hit. I don't play no football. And the damn so couldn't shoot. So, no, I did learn how to swim, and I still swim. I still swim. I love swimming.
That's good. Well, you found something that you could stick with, and it's carried you throughout life, which is
That's what you want.
Yeah.
And as you get older, you want to find something that don't tear up your knees.
Right. Yeah.
Because I have a lot of friends my age, man, they get knee replacements and hip replacements. And a lot of them athletes or former athletes, you know, they got beat up as a kid growing up.
Football and basketball definitely do that to you to impact your whole body that way. So I guess in some ways it's good. I mean, swimming, you can exercise, you can do you have a lot more from there. So that's excellent.
Thank you.
Yep. So where did you grow up?
Born and raised down the street in Berkeley, California.
Berkeley, California.
August 8th, 1940, Berkeley General Hospital.
Excellent. And what was it like growing up in Berkeley? You talk about just being in the Bay and being in the area.
It's very interesting. When I'm asked that these days, I have to remind people that when I was born and raised and growing up in South Berkeley, it didn't have at all the reputation that it now has as being this progressive liberal bastion of social justice. It was a segregated, white privileged place. There was a Mason-Dixon line, which is now Martin Luther King Drive. It used to be named Grove Street, where you were really putting yourself at risk if you crossed that and went into the white neighborhoods. There was a Republican-led city council, which was Trump-like, as I think back on it. But even then, there was activism in the black community. I grew up in the 40s and 50s as a youngster in Berkeley, seeing black folks, including my own family, my grandparents, my parents, my neighbors, people that I knew, actively engaged in politics and raising their voices about what was wrong in Berkeley and in the United States and what was wrong in general with the conditions of black folks. And so I had an early political education in Berkeley, seeing my parents involved. And I had I was blessed to grow up in a multi-generational household. I lived in a house, a two-story house in South Berkeley with grandparents, parents, and older brothers. It was a house that was large enough where we used to open the extra bedrooms to folks coming up south to visit, where they would have a hard time getting hotel reservations. They would stay with us. So I met many of my relatives over the years from the South on my mother's side. They were from Texas, and so many Texans visited us, and so I was able to see them and exposed to them. So I learned a lot growing up from them about life and living as a black person. So I was, and I must say this, South Berkeley then, I could claim that we had something similar to what was in Greenwood, in the neighborhood in Tulsa. We had a Black Wall Street on Sacramento Street and on Adeline. And in West Oakland, there was a Black Wall Street on 7th Street. So back in the day, we were turning the dollar over 3 or 4 times in the neighborhood. We didn't have to go far outside of the neighborhood to get what we needed and wanted and to make the connections. There were lawyers, doctors, engineers that lived in the same block or around the corner. So that's what it was like growing up in Berkeley.
So you were just mentioning the neighborhood you grew up in. It essentially was segregated, but there was its own Black Wall Street and a lot of examples of black professionals in your neighborhood. What would you say impacted you the most, or who impacted you the most as you were growing up? Wow,
that's a long list. As I described, I mean, imagine having a grandfather, a grandmother, a mother and a father, and 2 older brothers in your house that you could depend upon, who could give you advice, who would mentor you, who would spend time with you, it was just amazing. And my grandfather was a Baptist minister. In fact, one of the experiences that we had in Berkeley that I experienced was my grandfather being the pastor of the Mount Olive Baptist Church on Martin Luther King, which, by the way, the city took over through eminent domain to create the South Berkeley Library. But that was our church, and that church had a meeting hall, and my grandparents were very political, and that used to be the place where African Americans would be drawn to meetings to talk about what was wrong in Berkeley and to take a stand on various issues, especially education, which was very segregated in Berkeley. Malcolm X School was Lincoln School, where I went to school. And it, by the way, was the school that we lived next door to, and it too, our house then was taken over through eminent domain to expand the schoolyard to Ashby. But we used to live next door to the school. And living next door to the school, I had the experience and the privilege of being a student in kindergarten of the first black teacher that was hired in Berkeley, Ruth Actie. So, I mean, and I kept up with her through my adulthood, and then she passed away, but I'm getting back to the people who had an influence on my life and that I had access to. And of course, growing up, William Byron Rumford, who was an assembly person and who was responsible for the Fair Housing Act here in California. I used to run around and with my buddy, his son Randolph, was one of my running buddies, but his family was another huge influence. But there were just so many people, and that was the thing about South Berkeley back in the day, and West Berkeley, where some African Americans lived as well. We took care of each other. We took care of each other. You could go several blocks, and I grew up on Ellis Street. You could go several blocks in either direction, and you would know people whose houses you would pass. And if I was acting up before I got home, I would hear from them through a telephone call to my parents or grandparents. Neighbors were given permission to discipline us if we were out of pocket. That's the kind of neighborhood that we had growing up. And so those had huge influences on my life. And I think shaped me in terms of the confidence and the outlook that I have and the dependence that I know I can have and the interdependence of African Americans and what it can bring forth.
Yeah, it's that close-knit community is able to foster a lot.
And that's what's missing too much today. And I guess we might talk about that a little later.
No, we're certainly going to get to it. And it sounds like you were able to get a lot of lessons, as you mentioned, just from all these different influences. You mentioned your grandfather having the church, and was that also a big part? I was going to ask too, of just kind of like a constant thing, just being in church a lot, or just was your family all religious, or was it just more of your grandfather and that, or?
No, we were all, the entire family were involved. And the church in the black community was a institution that was a hub and a glue for community, not only in Berkeley, but in most places that you could name. It was a refuge. I mean, look at the role that the African American church played in the civil rights movement. It was a place where you could listen, learn, and take action. And that's the kind of focus that my grandfather had in Mount Olive Missionary Baptist Church. And so it was a place that had a big influence in my life. I still go to church. I'm not in a Baptist church. I'm in an interdenominational church now. But I'm a very spiritual person, and it comes from the upbringing that I had.
That, I think in a lot of ways that can color your experience, especially when you go out to other places, begin to meet new people and things like that.
Exactly. Exactly. And it wore off on me, and it paid off when I did work in the Black Belt South, growing up, organizing and volunteering and working professionally to save African American land across the Black Belt South. I was able to relate to people because I'd had some of the same experiences that they were having.
Makes sense. So what was that like growing up then, just having that kind of tight
Well,
community?
Berkeley was a very dynamic place in the late 40s, early 50s. It had a very energetic workforce. Everybody had a job. When I was in grammar school, there wasn't a kid in any class that I knew that didn't have a working father, and so in some cases a working mother. So there was a lot of economic stability as well. But at the same time, these dynamic families were dealing with, what the United States was like right after World War II, when black GIs came home and did not get the kind of benefits that white soldiers got, like bank loans for houses. Black communities were redlined, didn't get those loans. So a whole generation grew up without that kind of support from the federal government. Nonetheless, black families did pretty well in Berkeley, West Oakland, the flatlands of Oakland. There was a lot of black property ownership when I was a child, a lot. Now, everybody in my family, aunties, grandfathers, everybody had a house. And the construction of the Cypress Freeway, which came through downtown West Oakland, really basically destroyed an amazingly dynamic and growing community. Black businesses were taken, black homes were taken, and more importantly, the community itself was just, it was dismembered. Wow. And only recently did I learn that just didn't just happen in Oakland. That happened in virtually every black community with some urban stature, Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, all these places. I was horrified to learn that because it seemed like, you couldn't even call it a conspiracy. It's just like, a demonic plan, so heartless and so destructive, and no thought given to it, none. That's just the way we're going to do things. So we've got that legacy to cope with in terms of our housing situation, which is an immense challenge. So growing up in Berkeley was great in many ways. We had good public schools. We also had the illusion that segregation was a problem in the South, even though we had, de facto segregation right here in Berkeley. When I was a child, nobody lived, no black person, no person of color, Asian, whatever, lived east of what was then called Grove Street, Martin Luther King Jr. Way. And we didn't really question it, but that was reality. That was the way it was. And then it began to get questioned. And so throughout my childhood, issues of segregation and racism were always there. We went to bed every night, thinking about, how people of color were being abused. It was just going on, and it manifested in things like, stores not hiring black people to be clerks. When I finally got to college, after having graduated from Berkeley High School, where I participated in the boycott of Woolworths in Berkeley in support of the Southern students who were sitting in at lunch counters. After I went, right after I went to San Francisco State, I found myself fighting in the campaign to get black people hired as car salespeople. They would not hire black people to sell cars.
Wow.
Can you imagine that? I mean, it's just incredible. And yet it was just like, quote, normal, you know, until we said, no, you know, this can't stand. We're buying these cars, you know, why can't we sell them,
Right.
you know?
Yeah.
So growing up around here was a good experience for me, yeah, for the most part. I was always involved in one campaign or another. There was always something going on. And of course in Berkeley we had William Byron Rumford, who was probably the most important figure in the country when it came to ending racially segregated housing. He brought California's fair housing law into being. A brilliant man. He was a pharmacist. He had a little pharmacist down in Sacramento, a little pharmacy down on Sacramento Street in Berkeley. What else?
I was going to say, what or who influenced you most as a child as you were growing up? Was there anything specific that you can think of that did it for you?
Yeah, well, I can say who impressed me the most.
Okay.
I don't know who influenced me the most. I probably have to say my dad, but the person who impressed me the most was Paul Robeson. I met Paul Robeson when I was 7 years old, and I mean, it was just such an exciting time when he was in his prime and traveling the world and speaking out so articulately for so many causes, you know, mainly working people's causes, you know, labor organizing causes, and of course fighting racism and segregation, and man, he caught a lot of hell, and he was just a hero for me. He really was. Standing up against the federal government that took his passport away. They accused him of going to foreign countries like Russia and talking about black people being abused. And he said, I most certainly did. I mean, the guy was just, he was an incredible figure. It's just hard to put into words, you know, how he inspired people. He was also the first black man I ever met that wore a three-piece suit.
Oh, really? Really?
Everybody else wore overalls or, you know, maybe an occasional, you know, a jacket and tie, but, and he was, he just inspired a lot of people, yeah.
That's means a lot.
Yeah.
And so I assume you got a lot of lessons from just even hearing him speak or just having that experience.
Well, you know, there was a paper at the time called The People's World, Communist Party, or related to communism. I'm not exactly sure who published it, but it was considered a communist paper. And throughout my childhood, they followed Paul Robeson, so I got to see a lot of what he was doing and where he was and what was happening to him. And the causes he was getting involved in, yeah.
That's interesting. Well, just as you're just learning that and having those experiences, I'm curious, what does being black in America mean to you now?
Well, you know, in the last year, it's undergone some change for me.
Mm-hmm.
It really has. I sort of had a subtle attitude about, you know, where black people fit in the picture of this country. And that it was just sort of like kind of almost guaranteed not to change in any significant way. But I think that's clearly not the case. Things have changed for us in very radical ways in the last couple of years. You know, I had no idea that white racism was as bad as it is. I just didn't realize it. I don't know whether it was I mean, and the kind of stuff you hear now, I mean, like FedEx delivery people getting, you know, assaulted in neighborhoods. You know, who are you? What are you doing? This kind of stuff.
Yeah.
You know, just paranoid white people. And this stuff is just like spewing out all over the place. I mean, you know, I do have concerns about my grandchildren who are half Asian. You know, I have a Blasian family, and I never had any worries about that before, but I do now.
Interesting.
Being black in America has changed. It's a lot more dangerous. A lot more dangerous. Yeah.
That's interesting. I think what we see a lot of too is, particularly when it's run around police shootings or a lot of these other things, or what you're describing, even with delivery people
Yeah.
going up to doors. This probably has been happening, but now we're seeing it more because it's being
Yeah.
recorded on
Yeah.
phones
Yeah,
and
right.
and those things. So now we're getting in. People have to deal with the consequences
Yeah.
immediately versus just you know. letting
And
it
it's
fly.
spreading.
Yeah.
It's spreading. That's the other thing.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
It's definitely it's certainly a lot.
And the way in which these election issues have been kept alive, you know, complete fraud, just tells me how dangerous things are. I mean, you know, mainstream America is apt to be sold anything. I really, I mean, 70 million people voted for this guy, Donald Trump. That's a huge amount of people. And, man. So we're in perilous times, I think. And how this is going to get resolved is not clear. But I think our national politics is going to play out ugly very shortly. I think the 2022 elections are not going to be good. That's my feeling. I think there's going to be so much wrongdoing, so much voter suppression. It's just totally unleashed. But we'll see. Yeah.
That's certainly come up more, especially with voting rights, particularly whether you see it with some of the Southern legislators and other folks, and just really just kind of being vehemently against it in so many different ways, or
Yeah.
thinking of kind of loopholes to get around voting rights and creating these different laws and things. So yeah, it's definitely a big issue. Now, you spoke earlier just about dealing with a lot of the racism as you're going through school and from name calling and just kind of that type of bullying, and speaking about having to be this kind of smarter and dealing it within that instance by letting your grades speak for you rather than, you know, trying to fight everyone and stuff like that. But what would you say are some lessons that you've learned about, I guess, Black society and things as you were coming up and living in so many different communities?
You know, I'm going to do a comparison.
Okay.
When I was in the 50s living in the segregated Norfolk, Virginia, we could stay in our community. We had doctors, the pharmacy, everything was there, and there were black folks who operated it, which in turn, the dollar you spent circulated more and it stayed in your community. And that's because of segregation. You know, we were forced to live that way. When integration came about, unfortunately, the economics changed. Black folks started taking their dollars and spending them elsewhere. So, you know, to me, we're trying to go back to where we once were in terms of having our dollars, which means our folks, young kids, have to be educated to provide the services that we want. You know, so that would be.
That certainly makes a difference. You have mentioned a few examples, but I'm curious, what would you say is some of the biggest struggles that you've had to deal with in your journey, whether it was working with Black land ownership, possibly later on, whether it's doing mentoring? What would you say has stood out to you as like a particularly tough hurdle or struggle in your life that you've had to overcome?
Finding a set of incentives to keep black people who ought to know better and have it in their interest to act, to have their attention for action over the long term. What are the incentives? What is the frame? What is the argument that will keep us glued together in our own interest to make the kind of change? I mean, you know, imagine a poor person, a homeless person, who you're trying to get their attention to organize, to change their circumstance. You're competing with what they're going to eat next, how they going, what kind of blanket they're going to have that evening to stay warm. I mean, it's big time challenge.
Yeah.
So that's what I would say. What is the set of incentives to keep us engaged and glued together to build the kind of strength and power to make the difference that needs to be made? That's big.
Yeah, there's a lot that goes under that umbrella.
Yep.
For sure. And I'm just going to shift gears a little bit. You started to answer this, but I would definitely like to hear more from you. What does being black in America mean to you?
Well, it's a challenge. We're the other. We're really not seen as belonging. We are definitely a threat to those who have the white privilege and want to sustain it. We're here. There's not a day that goes by that we don't see evidence of that. They don't want us to vote. They're open about it now. I mean, you know, frankly, I've known that since growing up and being educated in a household that was political and experiencing racism myself. So I know that it's here and it's been here. And I have said this often. I am proud of myself in terms of how I have managed my rage and anger. I have been angry for all of my adult life and some of my childhood, quite frankly. When I learned about and experienced that they don't want us here, that they enslaved us, what they did to us, and just think about how we have been educated. For folks just now as African Americans to learn that what happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Right. Yeah.
I didn't hear a squat about that in school. Not a thing. Or Rosewood in Florida. I mean, isn't that something? Doesn't that tell you something?
Yeah.
These folks have swept it under the rug, and the nerve of them now talking about not outlawing critical race theory to be understood and absorbed, to deny the abuse and that they have rendered on us. That's America. So you talk about being angry. But I have learned how, I think, to manage my anger. I'm glad I haven't had a heart attack or a stroke behind it. But I have been pissed off for at least 60 years, 60 plus years.
Rightfully so. Rightfully so. Just speaking about that, what would you say being black, what does that mean to you in America right now in 2021? What is that? Has your perception of that changed over the years, or how do you feel about that? Just
being black. Yeah. Mm-hmm. You know, it's something that requires, again, having self-love will help you persevere through some of the, hopefully give you compassion to want to work with as we persevere through some of these changes. Mm-hmm. You know, I'm old enough to recall how, you know, the different civil march for rights, walks and stuff, how we thought things were going to change. But it seems like what has changed the most is the conservative white folks have figured out another way to refuse opportunity. Mm. You know, you look at Oakland, and not just Oakland, inner city schools, they aren't that great. You know, so be willing, you know, that's one of the things that I try to do as a person, is to volunteer to help, you know, work with folks, doing what I can to help them lift up so that our communities can be stronger. You know, we have some very talented young folks in our communities. Unfortunately, they want to not work hard and get paid. So that's